Hi, welcome to Lecture 11, Modern World. So, what are some of the other events that were happening before, during, and after the Cold War period? Yeah, well, although the USA and USSR dominated world politics from 1945 to 1991 as the superpowers, there were many other events taking place all over the globe. Some of the events were related to the Cold War politics of the time period, naturally, and so we're going to discuss some of these. One hotspot in the world has been the Middle East. Why? Well, it's complicated, to say the least. One of the primary conflicts seen in the Middle East today involves the nation of Israel between the Jewish population, or the Israelis, and the Palestinian Arab Muslim population. Both groups have historical ties to the region dating back thousands of years. In a nutshell, a very, very broad nutshell, Jewish people think the land is theirs, and the Palestinians think the land is theirs. And the two groups have been fighting over this for many years. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Jewish people from around the globe began flocking back to the land that they lay historical claim to. These people became known as Zionists, and they wanted to establish a Jewish homeland in what had become known as Palestine. And at the time, that was part of the Ottoman Empire ruled by the Muslim Ottoman Turks, who managed to keep relative peace between the two groups. But what do we already know about the Ottoman Empire from our study of nationalism? Well, yeah, it was one of the empires torn apart by nationalism. It experienced the bomb effect of nationalism. By 1918, the end of World War I, this created a bit of a problem. So who would make sure that the Muslims and Jews were not fighting? Well, the League of Nations. Right away you should be shaking your heads when I say that. Why? Well, what do we already know about the League of Nations and their effectiveness? And how do we know this peace organization is eventually going to fail? Yeah, well, we're going to eventually see another world war, duh. We also have learned that not everyone was a member of this peace club, so what kind of authority are they going to have over other countries and people? Yeah, so anyway, the League of Nations decided to put Great Britain in charge of the whole region of Palestine until it could peacefully rule itself. Does anyone else see the train wreck coming? Yeah, so towards the end of World War I, as the British exerted more and more control over the region, the British Foreign Secretary had an idea. He suggested creating a separate Jewish homeland within Palestine. This became known as the Balfour Declaration. A state was never established, and tension between Jews and Palestinian Arabs continued to mount. Well, following World War II and the Holocaust, with the massive displacement of Jewish populations from Europe and other parts of the globe, the United Nations created a separate Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Under the UN's plan, a majority of the land was given to the Jews, who only made up 34% of the population. The Palestinians were outraged by this plan. Islamic nations in the UN voted against the plan, saying the UN didn't have the right to go into another country, seize territory, and give it to someone else. Israel became a nation on May 14, 1948, and then the real fighting began. 6 Islamic states that bordered Palestine and Israel immediately banded together to invade Israel. There were many wars that followed, all of which are referred to as the Arab-Israeli Wars, taking place on and off in 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973. And in case you're wondering why, yes, the Cold War was also happening during that time. And yes, the USSR tended to supply arms to the Arab nations, and the US tended to back Israel during these conflicts. As a result of these wars, many people have been displaced from their villages and homes, and they've become, or did become, refugees. Over 600,000 Palestinians were displaced by the fighting and were forced to seek refuge in surrounding countries like Lebanon and Egypt. And if you're wondering, yes, these refugees wanted to go home to what they considered was their homeland. But the Jews also felt that they had a right to the land, so therein lies the basic conflict. The Arab-Israeli Wars included an event called the Suez Conflict, or Suez Conflict, in 1956. The Suez Canal basically connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Gulf of Suez, out to the Red Sea, and then to the Indian Ocean. Okay, based on your blank face, which I'm sure you have right now, I'm going to explain why you should care. Well, the Suez Canal allowed ships to travel from Europe to the Middle East and Asia without having to go around Africa. Yeah, it created a much shorter voyage, in the same way that the Panama Canal allowed for quicker journeys between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without the need for an elusive Northwest Passage or traveling around South America. It's a convenience factor, folks. Well, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the former French consul to Cairo, was given permission by the Ottoman Empire to build a canal 100 miles across the Isthmus of Suez in 1854. The canal opened in 1869 and today is a vital trading link for the world. Egyptian troops in 1956 seized the canal. Well, the British, French, and Israeli people took the canal away from the Egyptians, but the international community made them give it back to Egypt, and Egypt remains in control of the Suez Canal today. So that was the Suez Conflict in 1956. Well, the Arab-Israeli wars are complicated. These on-again, off-again wars heightened the conflict between all groups. Egypt and other nations got involved in these conflicts. Notable leaders who were leading their nations while these conflicts were going on include the first female Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, as well as the Egyptian President, Anwar Sadat. Eventually, we're going to see the Palestinians forming their own makeshift government called the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by a chairman named Yasser Arafat during the 1960s through 1990s. The PLO led numerous attacks against Israel during this time, as they attempted to gain back what they considered to be their territory in Israel. Over the years, foreign nations have intervened to try and stop the fighting. In 1979, the U.S. helped negotiate the Camp David Accords, which ended 30 years of hostilities, they thought, between Egypt and Israel, and was signed by Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin. Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by Muslim extremists. Egypt's new leader was Hosni Mubarak, who stayed in power as a totalitarian dictator until 2011 when he was overthrown. Okay, so add to all of this constant tension between Israel and Palestine, the Palestinians who still don't have their own nation, and you get a picture of the unhappiness and chaos that have plagued the area since 1948. The Palestinians resorted to an uprising in the late 1980s that became known as the Intifada. Palestinians began attacking Israeli soldiers and borders with demonstrations, boycotts, rock throwing, and eventually suicide bombings. This continued until 1991, when leaders from both sides met in Oslo, Norway, to discuss peace. The Oslo Peace Accords were signed in 1993 by Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO leader Yasser Arafat. Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist in 1995. The new prime minister was Benjamin Netanyahu. By 1999, peace seemed to be once again slipping away. Yasser Arafat died in 2003, and as of 2015, the Palestinian leader has been Mahmoud Abbas, and there are discussions today about whether or not to have an independent Palestinian state. The current leader of Israel as of 2015 is still Benjamin Netanyahu. Much of the other conflicts in the Middle East are related to the tensions between Israel and the rest of the region. But other conflicts in the Middle East also have their roots in the divisions that exist within Islam itself. And what we see playing out in Iraq and Syria today under the ISIS regime as of 2015 are directly related to those differences. Thanks for listening. More on this later. Bye.